She, beautiful and innocent, was sent like a living package marked to obey. He, a millionaire, spent his life avoiding love until he looked into her eyes for the first time. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The wind cut through skin like a razor when the iron gate of Black Mountain opened for the first time in 2 years. Ethan Morgan didn't expect visitors, didn't receive them, didn't want them. His private island, lost off the coast of North Carolina, was his voluntary exile from the world that had broken him and molded him into something he no longer recognized. There, among the glass and steel of the mansion he had built as a fortress, he commanded his empire of black diamonds through screens, codes, and a surgical coldness that he had learned to cultivate like one cultivates poison. But on that autumn night, when the sea swallowed the rocks along the coast and the sky poured thunder like screams of fury, something disturbed the order he maintained with military precision. The motion sensors triggered. The cameras captured a staggering figure at the gates. A woman, alone, barefoot, wrapped in a linen cloak that looked more like a shroud than clothing. Ethan observed through the security screens, muscles tense beneath. The black shirt he wore as the uniform of his solitude. She shouldn't be there, no one should. Access to the island was restricted, controlled, impossible without his authorization. But there she was, trembling under the torrential rain. Dark hair stuck to her face like running ink, wrists bound by a red ribbon that didn't seem violent, but symbolic, like a gift, like an offering. He could leave her there, should leave her there. But something about the way she bent against the storm, as if she were simultaneously fragile and unshakable, made his hand move almost of its own volition to the gate control. The iron opened with a metallic groan that was lost in the noise of the rain. When Ethan came down to the entrance hall, she had already crossed the abandoned garden and now stood before the glass door of the mansion. Her eyes were enormous, dilated by fear or confusion, and when he opened the door she murmured in a hoarse voice that seemed not to have been used for a long time, "It was a mistake. I shouldn't be here." But before she could faint on the wet, marble floor, Ethan caught her by the shoulders. The touch was electric, unexpected. It had been so long since he had touched another human being that for a moment he forgot how to do it without hurting. She was smaller than she had appeared from a distance, more delicate, but there was a hidden strength in her tense muscles, as if she were made of flexible steel. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "How did you get here?" She stared at him with eyes that seemed to be looking for something familiar in his face. "Sarah," she murmured. "My name is Sarah, but I don't know how I got here. I remember a car, hands pushing me, a woman saying that the master of the island would know what to do with me. Then, just the sea. I woke up on a vessel and thought I was escaping from something, but maybe I was being brought to something." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. The real world didn't make poetic mistakes. If Sarah was there, someone had sent her. Someone knew exactly where to find him and what her presence might awaken in him. But who and why? He led her inside, observing how she touched the glass walls with reverence, as if she had never seen something so beautiful and so cold at the same time. The mansion was a paradox, luminous and dark, welcoming and threatening, a perfect reflection of the man who inhabited it. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, more of a statement than an invitation. "Tomorrow we'll find out who you are and why. You're here." Sarah nodded, but her eyes continued to wander through the house, as if looking for clues to something she didn't even know what it was. And Ethan, for the first time in years, felt that his fortress had been invaded not by force, but by a vulnerability he didn't know how to fight. The following 3 days dragged on like a silent dance between two strangers who shared secrets without knowing what they were. Sarah always woke before dawn, with nightmares that left her breathless and confused, murmuring names she didn't even recognize. Ethan observed her through the mansion's internal cameras, something he would never admit to doing with previous visitors, because there were no previous visitors. She moved through the house with a reverent curiosity that intrigued him. She touched the books in the library, as if they were sacred relics, ran her fingers over the marble sculptures in the main hall, as if she could absorb the history they held. There was something familiar about the way she inhabited those spaces, as if it wasn't the first time she had walked through such wide and empty corridors. Ethan maintained physical distance, but obsessive proximity. He left food in the kitchen before she woke up, changed the towels in the bathroom she used, adjusted the temperature of the house so it was always perfect, silent care that he hadn't offered even to himself for years, but they never stayed in the same room for more than a few minutes. When she entered the library, he left. When he worked in the office, she explored the abandoned garden. It was as if they both knew that too much proximity would be dangerous. Sarah began to notice the details that Ethan tried to hide. Low voices that came from somewhere in the house during the early hours, tense telephone conversations in languages she couldn't completely identify, but which carried urgency and threat. Doors that always remained locked even when there was no apparent reason for it. And especially the way Ethan averted his gaze from certain corridors, as if fleeing from ghosts only he could see. There was a room on the second floor, at the end of the east corridor, in front of which he never stopped. He always hurried his step when passing by, and Sarah noticed that his hands closed into fists whenever that door appeared in his field of vision. What was in there that disturbed him so much? During meals, when they rarely ate together, the tension was almost palpable. It wasn't a tension of fear or distrust, but something deeper and more dangerous. Sarah felt Ethan's gaze on her, even when he pretended to be focused on the documents he always carried. It was an intense, analytical gaze, but also hungry. As if she were a puzzle he needed to solve, but feared the consequences of succeeding. "Why do you live alone here?" she asked one afternoon, when the rain returned to punish the glass windows, and the isolation of the island seemed more oppressive than welcoming. Ethan raised his eyes from the papers he was signing, those contracts that moved millions of dollars, in diamonds that she would never see. "Because it's safer," he answered, but the answer sounded like a half-truth. Safer for whom? For you or for others? The question hit him like a punch. He remained silent for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. But then he said in a voice so low that she had to lean in to hear, "For everyone." That night, Sarah had the most vivid dream since arriving on the island. She saw herself as a child, running through corridors that looked exactly like those in Ethan's mansion, but more colorful, more alive. There was laughter echoing off the walls, music coming from somewhere distant, and a dark-haired woman like herself, who picked her up and sang a lullaby that she could almost remember upon waking. But the most disturbing thing was that in the dream she wasn't alone. There was a boy a few years older who watched her with very familiar grey eyes, eyes like Ethan's. When she woke up, heart racing and hands trembling, Sarah discovered that she could no longer pretend that this house was strange to her. Each corridor, each door, each view of the sea awakened echoes of memories she didn't know she possessed. And Ethan. There was something about him that her body recognized before her mind could process it. It was as if she had been there before. As if, somehow impossibly to explain, this island wasn't just Ethan's refuge, but also, somehow, her home. The seventh day on the island dawned different. Sarah woke with a determination she hadn't felt since arriving, as if the fragmented dreams of the previous night had reorganized something fundamental within her. She could no longer accept living between walls that whispered secrets that seemed rightfully hers. While Ethan shut himself in his office for another morning of tense phone calls and contracts that moved fortunes, she decided it was time to break the unspoken rules of that house. The East Corridor had always been forbidden territory, not by words but by all of Ethan's body language when passing by. But that morning, when Sarah climbed the marble stairs that echoed her steps like a drum announcing an invasion, she found something unexpected. The door was ajar, not locked as it always had been, as if someone wanted her to enter. Her fingers trembled as she touched the golden doorknob. On the other side, the room was bathed in a golden penumbra, illuminated only by the filtered light entering through silk curtains yellowed by time. But even in the half-light, Sarah could see that this wasn't an ordinary room. It was a sanctuary, a mausoleum of memories preserved with obsessive care. The walls were covered with photographs in antique frames, photographs of a woman who smiled with a genuine joy that seemed impossible in that somber house. A woman with dark wavy hair, large expressive eyes, who wore light dresses and held flowers as if life were a constant celebration. And beside her, in many of the photos, a young man with grey eyes whom Sarah immediately recognized, Ethan, but a version of him she had never imagined existed. An Ethan who smiled, an Ethan who seemed capable of love. But it was when her eyes turned to the fireplace that the world stopped. On the black stone of the mantel, framed in worked silver, was a photograph larger than all the others. The same smiling woman, but this time holding a child in her arms. A girl of perhaps 4 years, with dark hair and rebellious curls, who looked at the camera with enormous, curious eyes. Sarah approached, the photograph with steps that seemed to move by themselves. Her heart was beating so hard that she could hear it echo through the silent room. The child in the photo was her. There was no doubt. The same shape of the face, the same curve of the lips, the same small birthmark near the left ear. It was her, but in a version that her memory had completely erased. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan's voice made her turn abruptly. He was standing in the doorway, his face as pale as paper, fists clenched at his sides. There was no anger in his expression, but something much worse. Despair. "Who is this woman?" asked Sarah, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. "And why do you have a picture of me as a child?" Ethan closed his eyes as if the words were blades cutting something inside him. When he opened them again, there was a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Her name was Isabella," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Your mother." The words hit Sarah like waves breaking against rocks. "My mother lived here with you. She lived here for 2 years. She was the only person who managed to make this house a home." Ethan approached slowly, as if each step was painful. "But she disappeared on a stormy night, exactly like the night you arrived, taking you with her." Sarah held the frame of the photograph so tightly that her fingers turned white. "I remember her. In my dreams, she sang to me. But you were there too. You were the boy who watched me." "I was 16 when she arrived here with you," said Ethan, now standing beside her, looking at the photo as if it were a sacred relic. "My father brought her to work in the house. But Isabella wasn't an ordinary employee. She was cultured, educated, spoke 3 languages. I never understood why she agreed to come here, to this isolation." "And me?" "You were a brilliant child, curious. You asked questions that disarmed even my father. Isabella said you would be a strong woman, that you would change the world." Ethan smiled for the first time since Sarah had met him, but it was a sad smile laden with loss. "And then one morning, you two simply vanished, as if you had never existed." Sarah felt the memories returning in waves, fragments of a childhood that had been erased but not destroyed. The smell of cake coming from the kitchen, the sound of classical music echoing through the corridors, the feeling of being safe in arms that smelled of jasmine and coconut soap. "Why didn't you look for me?" she asked, turning to face him completely. Ethan hesitated, and Sarah realized there were more layers to this story than he was revealing. "Because," he said finally, "I wasn't sure if you fled or were taken, and if it was my father who—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. The Morgan family patriarch, a man powerful enough to make people disappear, had reasons to want Isabella and her daughter far from his island. But what reasons? And why had Sarah returned now after so many years? The answer, she felt, was hidden somewhere in that house, and this time she wouldn't stop until she found it. The discovery of the room changed everything between them. Ethan could no longer pretend that Sarah was a stranger, and she could no longer accept the half-truths he offered, like crumbs of a story that was, by right, hers. In the days that followed, they began to talk, truly talk, for the first time since she had arrived on the island. Ethan told her about his father, Alexander Morgan, a man who had built the family empire on foundations of fear and absolute control. Isabella had arrived on the island when Ethan was still a rebellious teenager who dreamed of escaping that world of dark business and toxic family relationships. She was different from all the women his father used to bring. She wasn't there for money or status, but carried a mystery that was never completely unraveled. She said she was running from someone, Ethan told her one afternoon, as they walked along the rocky beach that surrounded the island. But she never wanted to talk about who. My father offered protection in exchange for companionship. But Isabella wasn't submissive like he expected. She was strong, intelligent, and refused to be diminished by any man. Sarah listened to every word, as if it were water in the desert. And with me? How did your father treat me? Ethan stopped walking, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. Alexander didn't know what to do with you. A child wasn't in his plans, but Isabella insisted that you be treated as part of the family. You grew up running through these corridors, playing in this garden, being educated by the best tutors money could buy. Then why did we run away? Because your biological father showed up. The words fell like stones between them. Sarah felt the world spin slightly. My biological father? Alexander wasn't... No. And when the man who was looking for you discovered where you were, Isabella realized there was no more time. On a stormy night, exactly like the night you returned, they disappeared. Ethan turned to her, his eyes full of an old pain. I tried to stop it. I begged for you to stay, but Isabella said it was too dangerous for you to continue here. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle reorganizing in her mind, but there were still enormous gaps. And what happened after we left? Alexander died 2 years later. A boating accident that never really seemed accidental to me. I inherited everything, the fortune, the business, the responsibilities, and the enemies. Ethan picked up a flat stone from the beach and threw it into the sea with force. That's why I live isolated here. That's why I don't trust anyone. That's why you stay alone, Sarah completed, finally understanding the extent of the exile he had imposed on himself. But that night, as Sarah tried to process everything she had discovered, something awakened her. Low voices were coming from somewhere in the house. Not Ethan's usual phone calls, but a conversation that seemed to be happening right there, in the mansion. She got up from bed silently and followed the sound until she discovered it was coming from the office on the ground floor. The door was ajar, and Sarah could see Ethan talking to an elegant platinum blonde woman who wore a red dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. The woman had a cold, calculated beauty and spoke to Ethan with an intimacy that made Sarah's stomach contract with jealousy. You can't keep her here, Ethan, the woman was saying, her voice laden with an authority she clearly wasn't accustomed to having questioned. It's too dangerous. For you and for her. It's none of your business, Victoria, Ethan replied, but Sarah noticed that his voice didn't have its usual strength. There was history between them. Complicated history. Of course it's my business. After all I went through to bring her back. Victoria stopped abruptly, as if realizing she had said too much. Sarah felt her blood freeze. Bring her back? Victoria had something to do with her arrival on the island? She moved closer to the door, trying to hear better, but the wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. The silence that followed was deafening. When Ethan appeared at the door, his face was as tense as Sarah had ever seen it. You heard? It wasn't a question. Heard enough, I imagine, said Victoria, appearing behind him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hello, Sarah. Finally, we meet properly. Sarah looked at the woman who had orchestrated her return to the island, feeling that she was facing someone much more dangerous than she had imagined. Who are you? And why did you bring me here? Victoria laughed, a crystalline and venomous sound. Oh dear, I'm the woman who should have married Ethan 5 years ago. And you are exactly the tool I needed to make him remember why he needs me. The look Ethan gave Victoria could have set the room on fire. But Sarah noticed something more disturbing. There were small cameras scattered around the corners of the office. Cameras that weren't part of the mansion's original security system. Someone was documenting everything that happened there, and Sarah had the terrible feeling that she and Ethan had fallen into a trap much more elaborate than either of them had imagined. The tension in the office was palpable when Victoria revealed her cards. Sarah observed the woman who had orchestrated her return, trying to understand the extent of the manipulation of which she had been a victim. Ethan remained silent, but Sarah could see the muscles in his jaw contracting, a sign that he was fighting to control a rage that threatened to explode. "You want to know the truth, Sarah?" said Victoria, walking around the room with the predatory elegance of someone who had always gotten everything she wanted through psychological games. "I spent 2 years looking for you. 2 years investigating every clue, bribing every person who might have information about where Isabella had hidden you." "Why?" asked Sarah, her voice firmer than she felt. "Because I knew you were the only thing capable of breaking down his defenses." Victoria pointed to Ethan as if he were an object. "Ethan became impossible after you disappeared. He shut himself up here, refused all my advances, built walls that not even I could tear down, but you were always his weakness." Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house, Victoria. Now." "Oh, I'll leave, but not alone." Victoria smiled and took a tablet from her bag. "You'll want to see this first." The screen lit up, revealing images that made Sarah stagger. They were photographs and videos of her and Ethan from the last few days, intimate conversations in the library, moments of closeness in the garden, and especially the devastating scene from the previous night when, finally overcome by the tension growing between them, they had given themselves to each other in a passion that seemed to come from another life. Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation and anger. Every intimate moment, every whispered word, every touch had been documented by hidden cameras that she had never noticed. "You filmed us," she murmured, her voice trembling with indignation. "Every second," confirmed Victoria, the satisfaction evident in her voice. "And now you're going to do exactly what I say, or these images will end up in the hands of people very interested in destroying the Morgan family's reputation, especially those showing Ethan getting involved with his late father's possible daughter." Sarah felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. "Possible daughter?" Victoria laughed cruelly. "Oh, you didn't know. The DNA tests that could clarify Isabella's paternity were all sabotaged or destroyed years ago. Nobody knows for sure who your biological father is. It could be Alexander. It could be the man who came looking for you. It could be anyone. But the images certainly suggest that Ethan doesn't care about that possibility." The horror of the situation hit Sarah like an avalanche. If there was any chance she was Alexander's daughter, then she and Ethan would be... She couldn't complete the thought, but saw the same terror reflected in his eyes. "You're sick," said Ethan, taking a step toward Victoria. "This is blackmail, psychological manipulation." "This is love," retorted Victoria, her voice suddenly vulnerable. "I've loved you for 10 years, Ethan. Since we met in college, everything I did was to give us a chance. Bringing Sarah here, filming our intimacy, threatening to destroy our lives." Ethan shook his head, incredulous. "This isn't love, Victoria. This is obsession." Sarah, who had remained silent processing the revelations, finally found her voice. "Where is my mother?" The question caught Victoria off guard. "What?" "Isabella. Where is she? If you manage to find me, you must know where." "She is too." Victoria hesitated for the first time in the conversation, and Sarah realized she had touched on something the woman didn't expect to discuss. "Your mother died 3 years ago. Cancer. That's why you became vulnerable, alone. That's why I was able to get to you." The pain that went through Sarah was physical, as if a blade had pierced her chest. Her mother had been dead for 3 years, and she didn't even know. She had lost the only person who knew her true story, the only one who could have clarified the doubts about her paternity. "You're lying," said Ethan, but his voice sounded less convincing than Sarah would have liked. "I'm telling the truth." "For the first time tonight," replied Victoria. "Isabella died in a public hospital in Miami, alone, poor, after a lifetime of running from ghosts that maybe didn't even exist anymore." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but refused to show weakness in front of that woman. "What do you want?" "I want you to leave this island and never come back. I want Ethan to understand that you can't be together, no matter what you feel, for each other. And I want," her voice became softer, almost pleading, "a chance to make Ethan truly happy." Ethan looked at Sarah, and she saw in his face the same conflict that was tearing her own heart apart. The possibility of being half-siblings hung between them like a toxic shadow, poisoning every feeling they had discovered for each other. But there was something else in his eyes, something Victoria couldn't see: determination. "Get out," he said to Victoria, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "Now. And take your cameras, your blackmail, and your lies. You have 1 hour to leave my island before I call the police." Victoria smiled, but it was a sad, defeated smile. "You'll regret it, Ethan. When you discover the truth about who Sarah really is, you'll regret choosing her instead of me." She left the room, leaving behind a heavy and toxic silence. Sarah and Ethan were left alone, surrounded by the wreckage of everything they had built together in the last few days. And for the first time since they had found each other again, neither knew what to say. The silence that followed Victoria's departure was more deafening than any storm. Sarah and Ethan remained in the office, separated by only a few meters of physical distance, but by emotional chasms that seemed insurmountable. Victoria's words echoed between them like slow poison, contaminating every memory of the last few days, every touch, every moment of intimacy they had shared. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "We need to know the truth," she said, her voice firm despite the chaos she felt inside. "About my paternity, about everything." Ethan nodded, but she could see the fear in his eyes, fear of what they might discover, fear that everything between them was based on something forbidden, impossible. "I have contacts, geneticists, private laboratories. We can do new tests, but it could take weeks to get the results," Sarah completed. "And meanwhile, we live with this doubt destroying us from within." They looked at each other, and Sarah saw that Ethan was fighting with himself. There was something more, something he still hadn't told. "What is it?" she asked. "What else are you hiding?" Ethan ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had already learned to recognize. "A few years ago, I hired investigators to look for you. They found clues about where Isabella had hidden, about the life you built away from here. And one of the things they discovered was a medical exam that Isabella had done when you were 7 years old." Sarah felt her heart speed up. "What kind of exam?" "Complete blood tests, including detailed blood typing." Ethan hesitated, as if the next words were blades in his throat. "Your blood type is AB negative, the same as mine, the same as my father's was." The world spun around Sarah. AB negative was a rare blood type, present in less than 1% of the population. The coincidence was statistically significant, but not definitive. Still, the possibility hung between them like a sentence. "That doesn't mean anything," she said, but her own voice sounded uncertain. "Coincidences happen." "Sarah," Ethan moved closer to her, but stopped before touching her, as if even this simple contact was now dangerous. "I remember things, from when you were a child, the way my father sometimes looked at you, as if he was seeing something of himself. And Isabella, she never talked about your biological father, but I always thought it was to protect someone, to protect you." Sarah felt the walls of the office closing around her. Each revelation was like another stone in her emotional grave. "So, you think we are?" "I don't know," said Ethan, and for the first time since she had met him, he sounded completely lost. "And this uncertainty is killing me, because everything I feel for you, everything that happened between us, was real," Sarah completed, taking a step toward him. "No matter what we discover about the past, what we felt was real." Ethan looked at her with an intensity that made her tremble. "But what if we're siblings, Sarah? What if all this is—" "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes," she interrupted, finally touching his face with trembling hands. "But I won't let Victoria's manipulations or the ghosts of the past destroy what we found in each other." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, memorizing every detail of each other's face as if it were the last time they could do so without guilt. Then Ethan inclined his head and rested his forehead against hers, an intimate gesture that wasn't quite a kiss but carried the same intensity. "I'll arrange for the test tomorrow," he murmured. "But until we have the results, we're just two people who met in a storm," said Sarah, "and who chose to love each other despite all obstacles." But even as she spoke these words, Sarah felt that something had irrevocably broken between them. The doubt planted by Victoria had created a fissure in their hearts that perhaps could never be completely healed, even if the tests proved they weren't related. That night, they slept in separate rooms for the first time since they had given themselves to each other. Sarah lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the island, the sea beating against the rocks, the wind whispering among the trees, and trying to ignore the loudest sound of all, the noise of her own heart breaking. On the other side of the mansion, Ethan remained awake too, looking out the window at the dark sea and wondering if there was any way to fight against fate when he didn't even know its true form. He loved Sarah. Of that he was absolutely certain. But would that love be strong enough to survive the truth, whatever it might be? The answer, he feared, would be discovered very soon, and perhaps it would be too late for both of them. The next 3 days were the longest in Sarah's life. Ethan had arranged for DNA tests through discreet contacts in New York, but the wait for results had created a tense and suffocating atmosphere in the mansion. They avoided being alone in the same room, talked only about practical matters, and the silence laden with unspoken words was corroding them both from within. Sarah decided to use this time to investigate on her own. If Victoria had managed to find her after so many years, she must have left clues about the methods she had used, and if Isabella had really died, as Victoria had claimed, then there were records, documents, people who could confirm or deny this version. While Ethan shut himself in his office trying to work to distract his mind, Sarah explored every corner of the mansion looking for evidence Victoria might have left behind. It was in the guest room where the woman had stayed the previous night that she found something interesting, a business card forgotten in a drawer from a private investigator in Miami. With her heart racing, Sarah called the number on the card. The voice that answered was rough, tired, of someone used to dealing with the darker aspects of human nature. "Walter Stevens, Investigations," said the man. "I need information about a case you worked on," Sarah began, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "About a woman named Isabella Rivera and her daughter." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Who wants to know?" "I'm the daughter," replied Sarah, and the truth in her voice must have been convincing because Walter sighed heavily. "I thought that case was closed. The woman who hired me said you should never know the truth." "What truth?" Sarah held the phone so tightly that her fingers hurt. "Your mother didn't die of cancer," said Walter, and Sarah felt the world stop. "Isabella Rivera is alive. She's been in a private psychiatric clinic in Miami for 4 years. She isn't well. She suffered a severe nervous breakdown and never fully recovered." Sarah had to sit down to avoid fainting. Her mother was alive. Sick, but alive. Why did Victoria lie? Because the truth was more complicated. Isabella started having hallucinations, talking about persecutions, about powerful men who wanted to hurt you both. The doctors said it was paranoia, but Walter hesitated. "I investigated her allegations. Some weren't paranoia. There were people looking for you two, people with a lot of money and a lot of influence." "Who?" "I can't say names over the phone, but I can tell you this. Your mother made a will before being committed, and in it she confessed the truth about your paternity. The document is sealed in a notary's office here in Miami, with instructions to only be opened if you showed up looking." Sarah felt her heart beating so hard it was difficult to breathe. "I need to see that will." "Then you need to come to Miami, in person, with documents proving your identity." After hanging up, Sarah sat in the guest room for a long time, processing everything she had discovered. Her mother was alive. There was a will that could clarify her paternity, and Victoria had lied about everything, or almost everything. When she finally went down to tell Ethan what she had discovered, she found him in the abandoned garden, looking at the sea with a desolate expression that broke her heart. "I need to go to Miami," she said without preamble. Ethan turned, and she saw that his eyes were red as if he had been crying. "The results arrived," he said, holding a sealed envelope. "They arrived an hour ago." Sarah looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. "Did you open it?" "I couldn't. I'm afraid of what we'll find." Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything she had discovered about Isabella, about the investigator, about the will in Miami. Ethan listened in silence, and when she finished, he said, "Then we'll go to Miami, together, and there we'll open the results and read the will at the same time." "Ethan, no," he interrupted her, finally approaching her. "No matter what we discover, we'll discover it together. You won't face this alone, and neither will I." For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to touch him, placing her hand on his chest, where she could feel his heart beating rapidly. "And if we're siblings?" "Then we'll be the siblings who loved each other before knowing the truth," he said, covering her hand with his, "and we'll find a way to deal with it." "And if we're not?" Ethan smiled for the first time in days, and it was a sad but hopeful smile. "Then we'll have wasted 3 days torturing ourselves for nothing." That afternoon they left the island for the first time since Sarah had arrived. The helicopter that would take them to the mainland waited at the helipad, and Sarah looked back one last time before boarding. The glass and shadow mansion seemed smaller from a distance, less imposing, more like what it really was, a golden prison where 2 people had found and lost each other at the same time. During the flight to Miami, they didn't talk much. Ethan held the envelope with the test results, and Sarah held the instructions Walter had given to find the notary's office where Isabella's will was kept. In a few hours, they would know the truth about everything. And their lives, one way or another, would never be the same again. Miami welcomed them with a humid heat that contrasted drastically with the controlled climate of the island. Sarah felt strangely at home walking through the historic streets of the city, as if some ancestral part of her soul recognized this place. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable away from his controlled territory, constantly checking his surroundings as if expecting some kind of threat. The notary's office was in Little Havana, in a colonial building that had been carefully preserved. The notary, an elderly man with thick glasses and ink-stained hands, examined Sarah's documents with almost irritating meticulousness before finally nodding. "Yes, there is a will in the name of Isabella Rivera, with specific instructions to be delivered only to Miss Sarah Rivera," he said, disappearing into the archives for several minutes before returning with an envelope yellowed by time. "Your mother left very clear instructions about when this document should be opened." Sarah held the envelope with trembling hands. On the outside, she immediately recognized Isabella's elegant handwriting, the same she saw in her fragmented dreams, writing shopping lists or small notes of affection. "Thank you," she murmured. They left the notary's office in silence and went to the hotel where they had checked in. In the simple but clean room, Sarah and Ethan sat on the bed, the 2 envelopes, the will and the DNA results, positioned between them like 2 sentences waiting to be read. "Which first?" asked Ethan, his voice hoarse with tension. "The will," replied Sarah. "I want to hear my mother's version before knowing what science has to say." With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and removed several sheets of paper covered with the familiar handwriting. She began to read aloud, and Isabella's voice seemed to echo through the words. "My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, it means you have managed to find the answers I never had the courage to give you in life. Forgive me for having fled, for having hidden the truth, for having allowed you to grow up without knowing your own story. I thought I was protecting you, but now I understand that I was only protecting myself." Sarah paused to breathe, feeling tears burning her eyes. Ethan held her free hand, a gesture of silent support. "The truth about your paternity is more complex than I ever admitted to anyone. When I arrived at Ethan's island, I was fleeing from the man who I believed to be your biological father, a violent and powerful man who had forced me and then tried to silence me. Alexander Morgan offered me protection, and in return I offered companionship, but you were not conceived from our relationship. Sarah felt her heart race. If she wasn't the daughter of Alexander or the man Isabella was fleeing from, then who? You were conceived from love, Sarah. From the only true love I knew in life. With a gentle, intelligent man who treated me with respect and affection when I needed it most. A man who was only a few years older than you are now, and who loved me with a purity I didn't know existed. Sarah stopped reading, her heart beating so hard she could hear it. Ethan was as pale as paper beside her. Your biological father is Ethan Morgan, not Alexander, but his son, the boy who became a man loving me, and who gave me the most precious gift I ever received, you. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt as if the world had stopped spinning. Ethan was her father, not her half-brother, not her stepfather, but her biological father. The man she had fallen in love with whom she had made love, was the man who had conceived her when he was still almost a boy. I know this must be shocking, the letter continued. I know it must seem impossible, but when I fled the island, I was 3 months pregnant and terrified. Alexander discovered our relationship and threatened to destroy Ethan if I didn't disappear. He said he would make it look like Ethan had raped me, that he would destroy his life before it even began. So I ran, and I raised you far from all of them keeping the secret that now must seem a terrible burden. Sarah let the sheets fall, unable to continue reading. Ethan remained motionless beside her, his face buried in his hands. Sarah, he murmured, his voice broken. We... Our father and daughter, she completed, her voice coming out as a whisper. And we did. She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what had happened between them in the last few days hit her like an avalanche. They had made love. They had given themselves to each other with a passion that now revealed itself to be deeply forbidden. Ethan stood up abruptly, walking to the window of the room. My God, Sarah, I am your father. I should have protected you, should have taken care of you, and instead, you didn't know, said Sarah, but her own voice sounded hollow. None of us knew. Does that matter? Ethan turned to her, his eyes full of horror and self-accusation. Does that change anything? Sarah looked at the envelope with the DNA results, which now seemed irrelevant. The truth was in Isabella's letter, written in the handwriting she recognized from a lost childhood. Ethan was her father. The man who had awakened in her feelings she had never imagined possible was the man who had conceived her when they were both too young to understand the consequences of their actions. And now, with this devastating truth between them, Sarah didn't know if it would ever be possible to look at Ethan again without feeling the crushing weight of what they had done. The love she had felt for him was now contaminated by a guilt that seemed to have no cure. What do we do now, she asked, but she already knew there was no simple answer to a situation as complex as it was impossible. The days that followed the discovery were the darkest in both their lives. Sarah refused to return to the island, and Ethan couldn't bear the idea of leaving her alone in Miami, so they rented separate rooms in the same hotel, living in a toxic proximity where each casual encounter in the corridor was a painful reminder of what they had lost. Sarah visited Isabella in the psychiatric clinic, an encounter that was simultaneously redemptive and devastating. Her mother, although mentally fragile, still recognized her and cried upon seeing her, murmuring incoherent apologies about having fled, about having lied, about having allowed the truth to become an emotional time bomb. I thought he would never find you, Isabella was saying, holding Sarah's hands with surprising strength. I thought you could live separate lives that you would never need to know. But fate has its own plans. Sarah tried to explain to her mother what had happened, how Victoria had orchestrated her return to the island, how she and Ethan had fallen in love without knowing the truth. But Isabella just shook her head, lost in her own mental demons. Love doesn't choose, she murmured. Love simply happens, But sometimes it happens in the wrong places with the wrong people at the wrong time. Meanwhile, Ethan had plunged into a state of self-flagellation that worried even the hotel staff. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, spent hours walking the streets of Miami like a tormented ghost. Guilt was consuming him from the inside out, and Sarah could see that he was destroying himself. One night she knocked on the door of his room and found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper scribbled with his nervous handwriting. "What is this?" she asked. "Attempts at a farewell letter," he replied without raising his eyes. "I can't find the right words to explain why I'm going to disappear from your life." Sarah felt a sudden and purifying anger. "You're pathetic," she said, surprising them both with the harshness of her voice. "You're wallowing in self-pity when you should be trying to find a solution." Ethan finally looked at her, and she saw that his eyes were red and swollen. "What solution can there be, Sarah? We are father and daughter. We made love. There's no going back from that." "There's no going back," she agreed, "but there might be a way forward." She sat on the floor beside him, maintaining a respectful but significant distance. "I've spent the last few days thinking about all of this, about what happened, about what we felt, about who we are now. And I came to the conclusion that you're right about one thing. We can't change what happened. But I also came to the conclusion that you're wrong about another. This doesn't have to destroy us." Ethan shook his head. "How can you say that?" "We committed. We loved each other," Sarah interrupted him. "Yes, we discovered later that this love was impossible, forbidden, wrong from any moral or social perspective. But at the moment it happened, it was real. It was genuine. It was pure." "Sarah, let me finish." She took a deep breath, organizing thoughts she had struggled to clarify in the last few days. "You gave me life twice, Ethan. Once when you conceived me with my mother, even being too young to understand the consequences, and another time when you found me in that storm and helped me discover who I really am." Tears began to stream down Ethan's face. "But what we did was love each other in ignorance, and now we have to learn to love each other in knowledge." Sarah extended her hand, not to touch him, but as a symbolic gesture. "Not as lovers, obviously. That's over and can never happen again. But maybe we can learn to be father and daughter." Ethan looked at the extended hand as if it were a lifeline. Could you forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive," Sarah said firmly. "Neither of us knew. Neither of us consciously chose this. We were victims of circumstances, of secrets, of manipulations. But now that we know the truth, we can choose what to do with it. And what do you choose?" Sarah smiled for the first time in days, a sad but hopeful smile. "I choose to have a father. I choose to know the man who gave me life, who will protect me, who will teach me about the world. I choose to transform this tragedy into something, if not beautiful, at least meaningful." Ethan finally held her hand, but now the touch was different. There was no passion, no desire. There was something deeper and in a way more powerful. There was the unconditional love that should exist between father and daughter, being born from the ashes of the forbidden love they had shared. "It's going to be difficult," he said. "It's going to be impossible," Sarah agreed. "There will be times when we won't be able to look at each other without remembering. There will be pain, guilt, moments when we'll want to give up. But maybe we can build something new on the ruins of what we had." They sat there for hours, holding hands as father and daughter for the first time, planning a future that would be completely different from anything they had imagined. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be possible. But it was all they had, and perhaps it would be enough to begin healing the wounds that fate had opened in their souls. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the veranda of the new house that Ethan had bought in Miami, watching the sea that stretched to the horizon. It was different from the sea of the island, calmer, more welcoming, without the cutting winds that seemed to carry ghosts from the past. Here she could breathe without feeling the suffocating weight of the secrets that had almost destroyed them. The transition hadn't been easy. There were moments when the pain was almost unbearable, when they looked at each other and saw reflected in each other's eyes the memory of what should never have happened. There were nights when Sarah cried alone, lamenting not only the loss of the love she had felt, but the impossible complexity of her situation. And there were days when Ethan disappeared for hours, walking through the city as if he could leave the guilt behind on the stone streets of Little Havana. But there were also small miracles. Moments when Ethan taught her about the family business, explaining the intricacies of the precious stone trade with a paternal patience she had never experienced. Afternoons when Sarah cooked for him, rediscovering recipes that Isabella had taught her in childhood, creating bridges between the lost past and the possible present. Long conversations about books, about music, about dreams, conversations that gradually became less laden with pain and more filled with a genuine connection between father and daughter. Victoria had completely disappeared from their lives after Ethan threatened to expose her manipulations. The hidden cameras were removed, the videos destroyed, and the Black Mountain Island was put up for sale. Ethan declared that he would never return to that place that had been simultaneously a prison and the stage of a tragedy that had almost destroyed them. Isabella remained in the clinic, but was slowly improving. Sarah visited her 3 times a week, and sometimes Ethan accompanied her. The encounters were strange and painful, but necessary. Isabella seemed to understand in her moments of clarity that she had created an impossible situation with her secrets, but also seemed relieved that the truth had finally come to light. "You found a way," she said one afternoon, observing Sarah and Ethan sitting side by side in the clinic's visiting room. "I thought the truth would destroy you, but you found a way to transform it into something new." Sarah held her mother's hand, noticing how Isabella seemed more fragile with each visit, but also more at peace. "We're trying, Mum, one day at a time." Now standing on the veranda of the new house, Sarah reflected on the last few months and the impossible journey they had traveled. Ethan had returned to business, but in a different way, more ethical, more focused on social projects that could compensate somehow for the damage the Morgan family had caused over the years. Sarah, in turn, had discovered a passion for social work and was studying to become a social worker, determined to help other people who, like her, had been victims of circumstances beyond their control. "Thinking about what?" asked Ethan, appearing on the veranda with 2 cups of coffee. Sarah accepted the cup and smiled, a smile that no longer carried the weight of guilt, but still retained the melancholy of a love that had to be transformed into something completely different. "Thinking about how strange it is that fate brought us together in such an impossible way, but perhaps it was the only way for us to truly find each other." Ethan nodded, watching the sea. "Sometimes I think that if we had known the truth from the beginning, perhaps we would never have developed the connection we have now. Paradoxical, isn't it?" "Very." Sarah took a sip of coffee, savoring the moment of peace they had built on the ruins of a situation that could have destroyed them. "Do you miss it? The island, the solitude?" "No," replied Ethan without hesitation. "That wasn't life. It was just existence. Now, I have a reason to wake up every day. I have a daughter to get to know, to protect, to love in the right way." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears, but they were tears of gratitude, not pain. "And I have a father." Finally. They remained silent for a few minutes, watching the movement of boats on the sea. Sarah knew there would still be difficult moments, that the shadow of the past would sometimes still haunt them. She knew that some people would never understand how they managed to overcome such a complex and morally ambiguous situation, but she also knew that they had found something rare and precious, the ability to transform a tragedy into redemption. "I received a letter today," said Ethan, "from an orphanage here in Miami. They need sponsorship for an education program. I thought maybe we could work on this together." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of pride for the man her father had become. "I'd love to. Maybe we can help other children not go through what I went through, growing up without knowing their true story. Or maybe we can help other parents not make the mistakes I made," added Ethan. Sarah looked at him, seeing not the man she had fallen in love with under, impossible circumstances, but the father she had chosen to love despite everything. The path they had traveled had been tortuous and painful, but it had led them to a place of peace that neither had imagined possible. "Dad," she said, testing the word that still sounded strange on her tongue, but increasingly natural. "Daughter," he replied, and for the first time since they discovered the truth, the word sounded like a blessing instead of a curse. The sun began to set over Miami, painting the sky in golden hues that reflected on the water. Sarah and Ethan remained on the veranda, father and daughter, watching the day end and knowing that tomorrow they would continue building a new life.